Righto, let's get one thing straight. A tidy procedure is not the same thing as a controlled job. That's the first blind spot. A document can be beautifully formatted, version controlled, signed off, laminated, probably perfumed by corporate on the way out the printer, and still be about as protective as a wet paper bag if it doesn't match reality. I see this all the time in investigations. Someone says, "But we had a procedure." Yeah? Good for you. You also had an incident. So clearly the existence of the document didn't finish the job. What matters is the gap between work as intended and work as done. Work as intended is the neat little world of procedures, plans, inductions, permits, JSAs, all the lovely admin furniture. Work as done is what actually happens at 4:40 on a Friday, when the workshop's full, the supervisor's chasing output, the spare gear's missing, and some poor bugger is making it work with what's in front of him. There's a reason the investigation material bangs on about planned work versus actual practice. Because that gap tells you where the system is drifting. And drift is sneaky. It rarely turns up wearing a villain moustache. It looks normal. It looks efficient. It looks like, we always do it this way. That phrase should make every investigator itchy. Take a simple example. Procedure says, complete the risk assessment, use the right support equipment, maintain separation, communicate clearly. Beautiful. Then in the real world, the workshop is jammed, the proper gear's tied up, the job still has to get done, so the task gets shifted outside, improvised supports get used, and the checklist becomes decorative literature. On paper, the control exists. In practice, it's been bypassed, diluted, or never really embedded in the first place. That's why documentation and control are not the same thing. Documentation tells you what the organization hoped would happen. Control is what actually shapes the job while it's unfolding. Big difference. And while we're here, procedures are necessary. Absolutely necessary. I'm not one of those goosey, just trust people blokes. No thanks. You need procedures, you need standards, you need revision control, current documents, clear instructions, all of that. But if you stop there, you're kidding yourself. A procedure without matching supervision, training, equipment, time, and reinforcement is just aspiration with a header and footer. The better question in an investigation isn't, did a procedure exist? It's, how was this task actually carried out? And what made that version of the job seem reasonable at the time? That's where you start seeing the blind spots, missing barriers, awkward equipment, confusing labels, informal habits, scope changes, workarounds that everyone knows about and nobody wants to write down. Because once it's written down, apparently it becomes real. If work as done keeps drifting away from work as intended, that is not a worker problem first, that is a system signal. And if your investigation can't see that, you're not investigating. You're filing stationery. So what actually drives behavior out on the job? Not posters, not slogans, not the 6 values on the lunchroom wall in 72-point font. Behavior gets shaped by conditions, pressures, assumptions, habits, what's available, what's missing, what gets checked, what gets ignored. The investigation guides are pretty blunt on this. Look at the people stuff. Supervision, communication, workload sharing, actual practice versus formal practice. Look at task and environmental conditions, time pressure, congestion, poor visibility, equipment availability, familiarity, fatigue, distraction, passive tolerance of violations. That's the machinery that pushes decisions around. Here's a classic. A worker bends a rule. Everyone gasps. Then you dig a bit deeper and find the rule gets bent every second day because the correct tool isn't available, the timing's unrealistic, the work packs are vague, and the supervisor only notices when something goes bang. That's not a naughty individual suddenly inventing mischief. That's a system training people to work around. Same with weak supervision. And weak supervision doesn't just mean absent supervision. Sometimes the supervisor is physically there, coffee in hand, high vis on, looking very supervisory. But there's no active checking, no verification of critical controls, no correction of known shortcuts, No follow-up after the initial instruction. That's weak. A body at the scene is not a control. Planning's another beauty. Poor planning is one of those quiet contributors that turns up everywhere. Scope changes on the fly, tasks overlap, the road's busier than expected, the workshop's full, the induction loop's in a non-standard spot. The job now involves extra steps no one really planned for. Then people compensate. And when people compensate often enough, the workaround becomes the real system. Training too, not the tick box version. Real training. The sort that gives people the knowledge, skill and confidence to recognize when the job's no longer inside the safe envelope. Plenty of incidents involve someone doing the wrong thing believing it was right, or at least close enough. That's not solved by yelling, "Procedure breach," after the event. You've got to ask what they were trained to notice, what they were taught to do, and whether anyone ever checked competence rather than assuming it. Then there's management tolerance of shortcuts. This one's deadly because it normalizes drift. If violations are routine, they're not really individual anymore, are they? They're organizational. The material is clear on that too. Routine violations, situational violations, organizational optimizing violations. Fancy labels for a pretty ordinary truth. If production, convenience, or schedule keeps winning, workers get the message. Loud and clear. I'll put it simply. If people keep needing to bend the rules to get the job done, the system is already busted. That's it. The workaround is evidence. It tells you the designed method is not workable under actual conditions. Investigators miss this when they focus too hard on the final act. Driver didn't stop. Operator didn't assess the risk. Worker didn't use the spotter. Maybe, but why did that make sense in the moment? What pressures were in play? What assumptions had been taught? What had supervisors been tolerating? What planning holes were already sitting there, waiting? That's the real game. Behavior is usually the last visible move in a much older system story. So if procedures aren't enough on their own, what has to sit around them? Plenty. Training, verification, monitoring, realistic resourcing, competent supervision, feedback loops, and enough honesty to admit when the job design itself is rubbish. A procedure works best as one layer in a broader system. The investigation guides talk about defenses for a reason: awareness, detection, control and recovery, protection and containment, escape and rescue. In other words, don't rely on one brittle line of text and hope for the best. Build layers. Start with training. People need more than induction wallpaper. They need to understand the task, the hazards, the limits, and the cues that say, "Stop, this is no longer the job we planned." Then verify it. Not assume it, verify it. One of the oldest organizational sins is confusing attendance with competence. Then monitoring. If your procedures are never observed in practice, never tested, never reviewed against actual work, they drift into fiction. Good organizations check whether the control is alive. Are pre-starts happening properly? Are risk assessments being applied when the scope changes? Are spotters actually used? Are alarms working? Are vehicle checks more than a pen trick? And resources. This is where plenty of systems fall over, while still sounding very committed in meetings. If the workload's unrealistic, the equipment is unavailable, the maintenance is overdue, the contractor interface is fuzzy, or the road layout is poor, then the procedure is being asked to do heroic work. It can't. Procedures don't compensate for chronic under-resourcing. Which is why investigations should target organizational factors and failed defenses, not just individual mistakes. That's straight out of ICAM thinking. Look at procedures, yes, but also training, contractor management, risk management, management of change, communication, maintenance management, organizational learning, supervision. Ask what defense was missing, what defense failed, and what in the organization set that up. Because when you only write, "Worker failed to follow procedure," you usually end up with rubbish recommendations. Retrain them, remind them, tell everyone to be careful. Maybe print a poster and whack it near the crib room. There we are, safety restored. Better recommendations come from better findings. If supervision was ineffective, fix supervision. If the procedure was unavailable or unsuitable, redesign it, and test it. If risk assessments weren't being done when work changed, tighten the change process. If shortcuts were tolerated, address the tolerance, not just the shortcut. If the control relies on ideal conditions that never exist, redesign the job. And yes, use the hierarchy of controls properly. Administrative controls have their place, but they're not magic. The material says it plainly enough. Further down the hierarchy, the risk still exists. So don't act shocked when another admin-heavy action plan produces another admin-heavy disappointment. Here's the blunt truth. A procedure is a tool, useful, necessary, often critical. But by itself, it is not a defense. Not on its own. The defense is the whole system wrapped around it. The planning, the training, the verification, the monitoring, the resources, the supervision, and the willingness to learn from what work really looks like.
That's the bit worth fixing.
Anyway, that'll do for this one. Next time we'll keep poking at the stuff people would rather leave buried, because that's usually where the learning is.